Everybody, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I'm Ryan Evans with the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And if this is your first time joining us or you're a repeat attendee, you know that today is part of our center's weekly webinar series. We typically do it every Thursday at noon Central. In fact, this is the first one in several weeks with some things that came up on our schedule, but we're glad to be back at it on Thursdays for the foreseeable future. You can always check out a full and updated schedule on our website at cap.unl.edu. That is cap.unl.edu. Today, we'll be talking about foreign investment and ag land in the U.S. And foreign investment in this country is not a new concept, but recent investments by Chinese corporations and government, though, have brought a new awareness and raised concerns regarding security ramifications. Recent attempts by the Chinese to purchase ag land near military bases has put the issue of state ownership restrictions in the news. So today on the webinar, we'll be examining foreign investment in both the U.S. and more locally here in Nebraska. We'll also discuss state legislation and federal legislation that are dealing with foreign ownership of ag land, as well as with limiting foreign investment in the U.S. that could potentially threaten national security. If you have questions as we go, we encourage you to put those into the Q&A box in your Zoom window, and we will definitely work to address those at the end. And really glad to have two great presenters joining us today. Presenting in a little bit, we'll be joined by Dave Aiken, a professor and agricultural law and water law specialist with the Center for Ag Profitability and Department of Agricultural Economics here at UNL. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Ryan, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Hanging in there.
Good. Thanks for being here. And to start us off, we're joined by Larry Van Tassell, professor of agricultural economics and director of our Center for Ag Profitability. Hey, Larry, thanks for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks for everybody for joining in with us today. Today, I'd like to give a brief overview of the U.S. involvement in foreign ownership, along with foreign ownership of ag lands in the U.S. and Nebraska, and then follow up with concerns with Chinese ownership of ag land and businesses in the U.S. Then I'll turn the time to Dr. Aiken to review restrictions on foreign ownership. Foreign investment in the U.S. and abroad is not a new concept. U.S. companies, base companies, own about 9 million acres in other countries and invest about $7 trillion in other companies also. As we see here on the PowerPoint, we have U.S. direct investment abroad and also foreign direct investment in the United States. So, for example, in Europe, the U.S. directly invests about $4 billion, and then or $4 trillion, and then in Europe, about Europe invests almost the same amount here in the U.S. And so you take a look here, that has increased from 2021 to 2022. Asia and Pacific, less of an investment both by the U.S. in their countries and their countries in the U.S. Then we have Canada invests more in the U.S. than we do there. When you talk about Latin America and other Western Hemisphere countries, we invest more there than they do here by quite a ways. Then we have Middle East and Africa, who the U.S. has some involvement as far as investing there. Why do we invest in other countries? Why do they come and invest in us? Basically, a lot of companies come to the U.S. because they have access to capital and natural resources here. We are the world's largest consumer market, and we are a global highland for creative minds, which helps with a lot of product innovation. Also, the ease of doing business plays an important role. We have a stable democracy here. We have a transparent and predictable legal system. And we also have a leading business mindset in this country that foreign investors appreciate. We also have a export platform that is different from most countries. We have a lot more rapid export procedures than many countries do at this time. Also, a big one is the foreign incentive programs. For example, right now, through the Inflation Reduction Act, we have several clean energy incentives, up to $369 billion in incentives, mostly through tax credits for such things as solar farms, battery manufacturing, also removing carbon dioxide from the air. This has caused some issues with other countries because a lot of foreign governments are crying foul, and they're exploring policies to try to keep their green investment at home and not have it shipped off here to the United States. Another reason why we do have what's called the Select USA program. It's been in existence since 2011 by executive order. And before that, there was an Invest in America program that had went on for several years. Basically, these programs are overseen by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and basically their job is to facilitate job-creating business investments into the United States from foreign countries and within our own country. For example, in this year, we had they put on an investment summit that had about 2,300 international delegates at it. 100 businesses from China were represented in that. What are the benefits to the U.S.? Well, basically job creation. We appreciate the investment here, the jobs that are created, the economic growth that ensues from that. Also, an important reason is it replaces imports. For example, when a car manufacturer from Japan or somewhere comes and sets up a plant here, it makes it so that we have the jobs, the economic activity happens here, and we have fewer imports than coming from those foreign countries. For example, when you talk about U.S. employment from multinational corporations, we can see that United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, Germany are all big employers here in the U.S. China has been an employer here, increased a lot till 2017, and we'll talk about that later, but it has dropped off since then. Now, there are downsides to foreign investment. A number of people are concerned about the erosion to our national security by foreign powers. Also concerned about theft of technology, opportunity to gather intelligence for foreign countries. Also, some are concerned about potential foreign control of the U.S. food and energy supply. Another big concern is the use of United States natural resources. For example, Saudi Arabia has a 10,000-acre farm in Arizona and are using the scarce water resources there to raise hay and send it back to Saudi Arabia for their dairy industry. And that's caused a lot of issues in Arizona because it's them pumping that water out of there to export has made a number of wells go dry. Also, there's competition for land resources, and that's perhaps at the expense of a younger generation that do want to enter agriculture. Now, total acres owned by foreign countries, foreign investors in the U.S. is about 40.8 million acres that are fully or partially owned by about 100 foreign entities. Now, that's about approximately 3.1% of the total ag in the U.S. Just as a side note, the U.S. based companies own over 9 million acres in other countries. So we don't own quite as many as foreign entities own here in the U.S. You notice here that Canada is the largest foreign owner of our land, followed by the Netherlands, Italy, United Kingdom, Portugal, and Germany. You notice China is number 18 on this list. And you also notice here that not listed is equal to about 2.5 million acres, or 2.5 million acres. Now, what happens is when a foreign entity comes into the United States and purchases land, or they have to fill out information on the purchase of that, and they have to tell in there what country they're from. What happens is sometimes they don't completely fill those out all the way, and so they're put down as not listed, and that's one of the issues by the powers in being is we don't know a lot about some of these lands and who owns them and what the investment is. Another thing to understand here is that when we say foreign owned or partially owned, it's also termed hold an interest in, and that could be the outright ownership of the land, or they could have a long-term lease, and long-term lease is defined as 10 years or more. For example, they could come in and lease land for a solar farm or wind generators on that land, and have the farmer still running the operation there on top of that. So that's an important concept to understand when we say foreign-owned land in the U.S. But they do have to be to own a significant interest or have substantial control of a domestic entity to be called foreign-owned. Now, what do they own? If you take a look here, the largest component is forest land. So we see here that about 20 million acres in forest. Cropland is next, followed by pasture land. We also have other ag land that'd be like marshlands or other land used for grazing other than pasture land. We also have other non-ag. That would include homesteads, roads, and commercial manufacturing, other things that are like that. You can see the trend from 2011 through 2022. There has been an increase in the amount of land owned by foreign entities, and you'll see here that cropland has really increased, and that's probably due to the fact of wind generation and solar farms occurring on some of that acreage. Just a quick look at how the concentration of foreign holdings. This is on forest lands. You can see the Pacific Northwest, the South, or the Northeast, and some of the Southeast are heavily involved in foreign ownership of forest lands. Up here in the main area, a lot of that's owned by Canadian industries, and they harvest that timber and take it back across the border. Cropland, you can see that it's distributed throughout the U.S., but quite a bit here in the Midwest here. You can see Nebraska, and we'll take a closer look at that later, but several of these western states have a lot of foreign ownership also. When you take a look at pasture land, mostly dominated in the West and throughout Texas, some in Florida. And this is total concentration there of foreign holdings of ag and non-ag lands throughout the U.S. Now, here we go with Nebraska. This is the number of acres owned or long-term leased in the various counties there. One thing that's noteworthy is here in Hamilton County, there are 19 acres that are owned by China. It's the only land holding that they have in Nebraska, and it's owned by Syngenta there. Syngenta is owned by ChemChina. And so that's the only acreage that is owned by China in Nebraska. When you take a look here, you can see that most of the land that is owned by foreign entities is cropland. A little bit of pasture and a little bit of non-ag or other ag, but again, 96% is cropland. Now, these are the countries that have an ownership in Nebraska. There are 20 known foreign countries represented here. Again, the largest owner by far is Canada, followed by Italy. And again, most of these are for electrical generation, mostly by wind. There's a total of about 800,000 acres that are foreign owned in 2022. Now, here's the parcels. So when you take a look here, there's almost 600,000 acres owned by investors from Canada. That's over about 1,400 parcels, with Italy about 432 parcels. And so a lot of these countries only own 1, 2, or 3 parcels throughout the state. Now, going on to China, there are some major concerns over China, and you've probably seen and heard those in the news now. One of the big issues is the Chinese government has control over private investors from China. For example, Shanghai had purchased Smithfield back in, I think it's 2013, Smithfield Foods, and the largest pork processor and owner in the world. And that is now part of WH Group from China, but they're required to adhere to the Communist Party's national economic agenda. And once they've adhered to that, then they are able to make their own business decisions past that. But the Communist Party is sort of a de facto board of directors there. So that's a concern for many when you look at Chinese ownership here in the US. Part of that is the national security issues by people. For example, you've probably heard in the news when China purchases land near an Air Force base or something, one of the issues, concerns is, can some of their telecommunication equipment there disrupt communications on the Air Force base? Another big issue is technology theft and also intelligence gathering. So those are some of the major concerns over China owning land or businesses in the US. And that also goes with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now, just take a look at China. They lead in overseas land acquisitions. For example, here they own a lot of land in agriculture, but majority in forestry and a bunch in mining. UK is second, and then followed by the US and then Japan on land ownership in other countries. When you take a look at what Chinese companies have invested in with agriculture, Myanmar, Russia, Cambodia, Venezuela. Forestry is mostly in the Congo and some in Russia there, and mining, Peru, and a lot in some of the African countries there is where they're setting up there. What's interesting is Chinese investments in the US are in a lot of areas other than just agriculture. And that grew a lot from 2005 up to 2016. For example, 2016, there was 63 deals that took place for about $53.5 billion. After that, you can see that the annual investment from China has really decreased. One of the reasons why was in 2016, the US made it more difficult for China to own technology companies and that type of thing. So their investment has went out of the US and went to other places. But that doesn't mean they still don't have a presence here. This shows the same type of investment by China, but I just wanted to show here, the green here on the bottom shows what they call greenfield. In other words, they're startup businesses. They come here and start something up from the ground up. The rest of these in the blue are just they just acquired other companies. It's what they've done. And so when you take a look at total assets, even though they quit increasing in 2017, those assets are pretty well still owned by China in the US. Just a quick look here at where China does, what kind of businesses they are involved with. Agriculture is one of the minor ones, actually. But when you take a look here at real estate, technology, transportation, finance, entertainment, energy, those are all areas that China has invested heavily on in the US. And what has happened since China has started to disinvest in some of these things, they've went to other countries. These are local jobs. These are jobs provided in the US by China, and you can see that's really decreased since 2017. And a lot of those jobs that went over to the European Union and the UK, a lot of that has to do with the electric vehicles and their investment there and the batteries. And so a lot of US manufacturers feel that this has given an unfair advantage actually to the European Union and the UK, having China, their expertise, their resources over there, investing in that. Here's the Chinese ownership of ag land in the US from 2010 to 2021. You can see here, fairly small, but in 2013, the increase, and that was from purchasing Smithfield. I think they're about 240 some odd thousand acres thereabouts that went along with that. And then more recently, China, some investors from China has purchased some lands down in Texas, originally with the intent of putting up energy generating technologies. And then Texas went in and said, no, we're not gonna let you do that. And so 2022, a lot of those holdings were sold to a Spanish company, and they were able to move forward with the wind generation down there. Just quickly take a look here. This is Chinese owned land, farmland in the US, and this is Canadian owned. So there's quite a disparity there. And you'll see in Nebraska there's that 19 acres that it's owned in Hamilton County by Syngenta there. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, but go ahead and turn the time over to Dave at this time.
Thanks, Larry. And as Dave is preparing his slides, one question did come in on the Q&A. I just want to sneak it in here real quickly. Just ask, when you started the presentation, you were mentioning the United States owns farmland overseas. The question was if you meant the US government is buying farmland or private companies or individuals based in the US.
That's a good question, and sorry I wasn't clear at that. It is all of these investors are typically private companies. Now, some of the investors from China have a lot closer connection to their government than some of the people and companies here in the US, but it is private ownership or corporate ownership of those lands and not the US government.
Perfect. Thank you. A reminder, if you do have questions, put those in the Q&A and we'll get to them after Dave is done with his presentation. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Professor Dave Aiken, our agricultural law and water law specialist here at the Center for Ag Profitability. Dave?
Believe you're muted, Dave.
Is that better?
Yep, we got you now.
Okay. I apologize. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Larry. I really appreciated your overview and looking at what China is doing globally, as well as in the United States, as well as in Nebraska. So that's very great background. Now we're going to take a look at what are the states and the federal government doing, especially with regards to national security concerns. And the national security concern is a fairly recent one, in terms of the history of restrictions on foreign ownership of ag land in the United States. So we're looking at kind of a period of change and a new focus in terms of what we want these laws to do that perhaps they hadn't done in the past. So we're going to take a look at the state laws very quickly. we'll look at the existing federal programs that deal with this issue of foreign investment in the United States, especially from a national security angle. And then we'll look at some new developments on the horizon, potential developments that may impact on this issue in time, and that's the so-called beneficial ownership registry. And also what broadly is Congress looking at in terms of dealing with this issue, and when we might see some of those policies be enacted. And then we'll end up with a quick look at what might happen to our foreign ag land ownership laws here in Nebraska. Okay, a lot of this information, especially with regards to recent changes in state laws, and there have been a lot of recent changes, is due to the information is from the National Ag Law Center in Arkansas. And so that information has been very helpful. And if this is an area you're interested in, Google National Ag Law Center, and and that'll take you to their website. Okay, just very broadly in perspective, 74% of the United States is agricultural land. So when we're talking about foreign restrictions of agricultural land ownership, that takes a big chunk of land in the United States. It's not everything, and some laws do address more than just ag land, but ag land is a big part of our land base, obviously, in the United States. The state restrictions vary. Some of these laws go back to basically to colonial days, so they go back, a couple hundred years or longer, and so they've changed over time. Our laws go back to, I think, 1889 or something like that in Nebraska. So we've seen some changes over time as well. The foreign adversary, concerns about China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, or countries on the terrorist list, or a lot of different ways to slice that. That is a very recent focus and has stimulated a lot of the new state laws that we'll see. Most states did not have any restrictions on foreign ownership of agricultural land until very recent concerns about the land purchase by the Chinese or Chinese entities near military bases here in the United States. Now we're up to 24, so almost half the states restrict purchases or leases of land by foreign individuals or business entities. And lots of people have opinions about, are these restrictions, are these state restrictions constitutional? Do they deprive some people of constitutional rights and this sort of thing? There is Florida passed a law which is in court, and that is one to watch in terms of where that's going. So far, the judge has said that the Florida law that appears to be constitutional, and it certainly can go to trial, and the people challenging it cannot get an injunction to have the enforcement of the law stopped. So it looks like that law is going to be upheld. Okay, the red states are states that the B states that restrict alien ownership of land ownership. The blue states are states that have no laws on the books, and then the green states are states that allow it. So there are quite a few states that still allow it, but there are more states that have established new restrictions than there had been in the past. And there were 12 laws, 12 new state laws that were established this year in terms of restricting alien ownership. And they're listed there in the first line. North Dakota and Oklahoma already had laws on the books, but they updated their laws a bit to give it more of a to incorporate some national security factors into their laws. And they either restrict China or they restrict the so-called Big Four, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, or any country that's on one of a number of federal foreign adversary or terrorism lists that are maintained by different agencies in the federal government. And the 10 of the 12 have that focus. And there are two states that had provisions that I felt might be relevant to considerations of what we might want to look at in terms of updating our laws in Nebraska. If we're concerned about the national security issue, which I feel is a very relevant issue in this whole area, in Ohio, the Ohio Secretary of State is developing a registry of states of nations that are entities or individuals from those nations will be banned from purchasing land in Ohio. And there are different federal lists maintained by different federal agencies, either foreign adversaries, terrorist list, international terrorist list, so forth. So that's an interesting provision and one that I think would be relevant to take a look at. The second one is one of the new provisions in the update of the Oklahoma land ownership laws, and they restrict alien or non-citizens acquiring lands directly or indirectly through business entities like corporations or limited liability companies or through a trust. And the deed that is recorded with the county officials when the land is purchased must include an affidavit or a legal document certifying that the buyer complies with the state law, including this saying that it's not a dummy corporation for a foreign entity, that type of thing. And typically these are signed by the lawyers that are handling this deal. So if the lawyers sign something that they know is false, if that's found out, then they can lose their license to practice law. Okay, this shows the change that happened in 2023. And so you see the states in 2022, going back to the 1980s, which was the last time that I looked at some of this corporate farming restrictions in the United States. That block of states from North Dakota down to Oklahoma, Minnesota down to Missouri, and then Wisconsin, that block of states were the states that had restrictions on corporate farming, similar to the Initiative 300, that we had in Nebraska for quite a few years before it was struck down in federal court. And so these states all have these, Initiative 300 type restrictions that included not only corporate owners from outside the state who didn't meet some kind of family farmer classification, but also entities in corporations that were, from outside of the United States. But then you see the 2023 list, and the list of the red states is the red area on the map is much larger, and a lot more states have gotten involved. Okay, a very quick look at Nebraska's current restrictions. And again, our law goes back to March 16th, 1889. And so it's an old law. And it says, aliens, and here it just mean people who are not citizens of the United States, under the Nebraska law, are prohibited from owning land or leasing land in Nebraska. But a short-term lease up to 5 years is legal, but anything longer than that is not legal. Then, land that is owned by non-U.S. citizens as of March 16, 1889. The land may be owned and bequeathed to heirs, and the heirs can own it for up to 10 years, and then the land must be sold. Presumably, all of that grandfathered land has been sold, because that was, a long time ago. And so, but that's how that was taken care of. There are a lot of exemptions, and one that needs explaining says land acquired by will or inheritance. If you inherit land and say that you come from a mixed race family, and one of the families, one of your mother or your father, one of your parents is a Nebraskan that legally inherited land from their family. If they leave the land to you and you are a non-resident of the United States, then you have 5 years to divest that land. Land within cities and villages is exempt, and then within the 3-mile extraterritorial zoning jurisdiction of cities and villages. Farm corporations have to file report. Now, this is under Initiative 300. To file reports with the Nebraska Secretary of State. That's one area that we probably want to look at again. And how do you monitor this? How do you know that the corporation that is buying this land is not a front for some bad guys, whether they're Chinese or whether they're drug cartels or whoever it might, organized crime, whoever it might be. We don't really know. And there's no really good way of finding out who are the actual people behind these corporations or these limited liability companies or other business entities. What's the enforcement mechanism? What's the penalties? And then a big issue is we've got a lot of options, I believe, on from foreign companies who want to, they pay a farmer or a rancher a few bucks an acre per year for an option to develop a wind farm or a solar farm sometime in the future, and they may be waiting to see if they can get the zoning and everything else that they need lined up in order to develop the energy facility, and then once they get that, then they can sign a lease with the farmer. But is any of that legal? Is any of that legal in Nebraska under current law? It looks like it might not be. Certainly, it's a big question mark. So that's something that should be addressed, I think. Okay, now let's look at what do we have at the foreign level. We talked about the USDA reports. That's under the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act of 1978, or a FIDA, is sometimes referred to. These forms are filed with the local FSA office where the land is located, and Larry mentioned that in some of these categories we say we don't know which country it is, because these forms are incomplete. That is an issue that Congress is looking at. How do we tighten this up so that this is a more reliable source of information about who are the people acquiring the land in the United States. But when people talk about many of the statistics that Larry shared with us about foreign ownership in the United States come from these reports, and USDA does annual annual reports that are updated based on the most recent information that they have, and so forth. In 2022, Congress said that they want to make this more of an online type of filing system, and and so, and then allow some public access to that information, not uh, not all the information, but and this is something that we won't know until USDA actually comes up with the database. But there will be some limited public access to this information, hopefully by 2026. Now, but of course, this doesn't get at the question of, are there people hiding behind these corporations who do not, and the corporations are not self-identified as foreign? Is any of that going on? And we don't really know, and we really don't have the tools to find that out. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about beneficial ownership. Okay, the second major law, and there are a lot of federal laws regarding, trying to protect national security in the United States, and that's way beyond the scope of this talk. But the one that looks at, foreign investments in the United States is this Cepficus committee, or Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. And Jim Exon was, former governor, former U.S. senator, was one of the two people in Congress who sponsored this amendment to defense statutes to establish this committee. And it's an interagency committee of which USDA is not yet a member. And there are a lot of people who want to get USDA on that list. Tom Vilsack has said he thinks it would be great if USDA got on the FICUS committee as kind of a permanent member. And so that's probably something that's going to happen. But they review national security implications of pending foreign investments, or maybe investments that have already taken place and for which they didn't file with the FICUS committee to get the FICUS review before they went through with the transaction. But the focus is computer technology, defense technology, critical infrastructure, this type of thing. And the investors are required, but the ball is in their court. They have to notify the committee to see whether it's something that the committee needs to take a look at or not. And then the committee makes recommendations to the president in terms of whether it should be prohibited, or whether there should be some modifications, or whatever it might be. Sometimes the fact that the committee just investigates it is enough to kill the deal. But this is something that has been on the books for quite a while. I think over 20 years. But again, we don't know if there are people hiding behind corporations that look like they're domestic, that is U.S. corporations, legally set up in the U.S. and stuff. We don't know if there are foreign actors hiding behind those corporations or not. Now, there's a lot of interest. There have been a lot of proposals in Congress, and I don't have time to go through them all. There's way too many. But both the Senate and the House have adopted slightly different amendments to either the Defense Appropriation Act or to the USDA appropriation. One part of the spending bills that are pending before Congress, tied up because of the potential shutdown, all that kind of stuff. But it's very likely, in my opinion, that when these spending bills are finally approved, that probably in the defense bill there will be some type of federal either restriction or process to look at either restricting purchases from countries that are on certain lists, certain national security lists, from buying any land in the United States, not just ag land, but that would be the big one. And so that I think there'll be something in the appropriation bills. It could also be a part of the farm bill. Certainly, the farm bill would be an appropriate vehicle to look at changing the reporting system that comes through the FSA offices. So, but again, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Okay, now I'm going to talk about something that was a brand new issue to me, and I have hats off to Jessica Groskopf, out of Scottsbluff. And this is the Corporate Transparency Act. And it's trying to deal with the problem of shell corporations. You know, shell corporations or dummy corporations, they are set up, could be in Delaware, but could be offshore as well. And they're there to, much of the time, not all the time. I mean, there are legitimate business purposes for these companies, but they are also illegal purposes as well. You know, they're used for tax avoidance, money laundering, and so forth. And so most industrial countries have required all their corporations and limited liability companies to come in and say who are the people who are actually involved in this company. And if there's a trust or if the corporation is a shareholder or something like that, they'll say, fine, who's in that corporation? And they try to get at who are the people behind. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 different corporations that you have to trace through before you get back to where the people actually are. And this is to try to crack down on money laundering, tax avoidance, and stuff like that. In 2021, Congress adopted the Corporate Transparency Act, and that will require, beginning January 1st, 2024, all corporations and all limited liability companies, with some exceptions, will have to file these information forms with the Treasury Department, identifying who are the people who are basically in control of this business entity. And this is an important topic. It's something that a lot of businesses in Nebraska are going to have to comply with, including farms and ranches, if they're incorporated or they're in an LLC. And so there's going to be a later program on this, either in October or November, to deal with what's in the Corporate Transparency Act. But the objective is to have this online database so that U.S. law enforcement can have some way to trace the bad guys through their shell corporations back to who they really are. And okay, we're running short on time, so we're gonna go back. Sorry. There, okay. Wow, there we go. Okay, if we had this beneficial ownership registry up and running, it would be possible that states, like Nebraska, could have access to that information, or at least, make requests maybe to USDA or something like that to say, are these guys on a watch list, or is this a legitimate corporation, or, who's actually behind all this? We will have to see, that's Congress would have to make that decision. But, that could help out on some of this in the past. Okay, okay, I mentioned wind and solar energy, other things, other provisions that are being discussed at the federal level, but that we should, I think, are fair to consider at the state level as well, as this, there's going to be a lot of state cooperation, the state and federal cooperation on this issue. We hope, there have been proposals that agriculture be considered part of critical infrastructure, and clearly military installations, food supply and food security. All of these things I think would be appropriate for consideration in terms of who we want to use our alien ownership laws to try to protect it some way if we can. Okay, I'll stop right there and turn it over to Ryan for questions.
All right. Thank you, Dave. One question, I think it came up around slide 10 in your presentation there. If you could clarify, you mentioned the big four at some point around there. Who are the
Right.
big four?
That's China and Russia and North Korea and Iran.
Perfect. Thank you. Larry, maybe you can answer this one. I think it was in the presentation, but do we know how much of Nebraska is ag land?
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure, Ryan, what all they want there, but we've got about almost 50 million acres in Nebraska, and 45 million of those, almost 90 some odd percent, is ag land. Half of that is cropland. But as far as foreign investment goes, they have about 800,000 acres, which is less than 2% of ag land. Now, are those being used for farming or not? I can't answer that other than in the title of the company that purchased them, over 90% of them have wind or solar in their titles. So they're probably being used for energy generation. But as far as who's farming that land, I'm not positive, but it's about less than 2% of all Nebraska has a foreign ownership there.
Okay. Thank you. I want to remind folks that we still have a few minutes. If you want to get a question in, we'd be happy to take that in the Q&A panel. We have a couple more to get to here. I'll also let everybody know right now the recording will be available along with the slides. We'll post those likely later this afternoon in the archive section of our website webinar page. If you go to cap.unl.edu, I'll put that link in the chat. Did you notice anything? I don't know if you looked into land prices and if those have been affected or not in the areas that are surrounding foreign owned acres.
The U.S. Recently did a study there, and what they did is looked at land prices in counties where there had been foreign investors and in counties where they had not been foreign investors, and they didn't notice any difference in land prices between them. But, you know, from an economic standpoint, anytime you have more buyers, it's going to drive the price up, right? And so, but they didn't notice any difference in counties that did and didn't.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dave, in Nebraska, is the unicameral interested in this issue? What's the level of interest there, and how are they approaching this?
Yes, I think on the 15th of this month, the Agriculture Committee had a public hearing on the alien ownership laws in Nebraska and, you know, nationally, and got Micah Brown from the National Ag Law Center in Arkansas to come up and talk to them about the legal aspect. And it's clear that there are some, because the law, much of the law is very old. There will be some updating that needs to be done. But if they also want to address some of these foreign security, national security issues, excuse me, then that's going to take some additional work and discussion as well. But you know, the provisions from Ohio and Oklahoma that I highlighted in the early part of my presentation, you know, are two states that have tried to start to get a handle on that, and so that I think their experience and where they're at in terms of adopting their regulations and so forth could be very helpful.
Great. Thanks, Dave. There's a question if there will be a webinar focusing on out-of-state interests in Nebraska farmland, like private equity companies, Bill Gates, et cetera. We don't have anything like that scheduled, but perhaps that's an issue we can dive into down the line as well. I will say that I know Dave and Larry on this webinar, they're planning some more coverage of this issue. So stay tuned to our website, cap.unl.edu. Make sure you're signed up for our newsletter there to get the latest. I think we likely will have some podcasts and articles coming out about this. Still a few minutes left. If anybody has any more questions, I'll leave it open for a minute before we wrap up here. And when you close out a Zoom today, as you leave, you should be presented with a survey that will pop up. It's just very quick, very short. Gives us a little bit of feedback on how this webinar went. And if you have ideas for other webinars, we would always love to hear them. You can submit that there or get a hold of us at cap@unl.edu. I don't see any other questions right now, so we will go ahead and wrap up. Do make sure you check our website for more upcoming webinars. Again, we'll be back most Thursdays over the noon hour. But I really want to thank you, Larry Van Tassell and Dave Aiken, for a great presentation today. And most of all, thank you, everybody, for attending today and supporting this webinar series. We hope you found it useful and informative, and do keep up with the Center for Ag Profitability again on our website. I put it in the chat where the webinar recording will be later, but until we talk to you again, we hope you have a great rest of the week. Dave, Larry, thanks again.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody.